The night the power died across Millbrook County, Janet Pierce sat 12 feet underground in a steel-lined shelter she'd welded into her cellar, listening to the ice accumulate above her head while her propane heater hummed steadily against walls that held 68 degrees without effort. And somewhere in the frozen dark beyond her insulated door, she could hear them now. The neighbors who'd spent 6 months calling her paranoid, calling her crazy, calling her the weird divorced lady who'd lost her mind after her husband left, making their way across the ice-slicked roads toward the one house in town that still had light glowing through its basement windows. 8 months earlier, nobody in Millbrook thought much about Janet Pierce one way or another. She was just another face in a small Iowa town, someone who'd lived quietly on Maple Street for 15 years, worked data entry from home, kept her lawn trimmed, waved politely when people passed. The kind of person you'd forget 5 minutes after seeing her. Then Greg left. Not dramatically, not with accusations or fury, just a quiet conversation one April morning that ended with him packing 2 suitcases and driving to Des Moines to start over with someone younger. The divorce papers arrived 3 weeks later, signed without contest, splitting everything down the middle except the house, which he didn't want. Janet kept working, kept her routines, stayed polite when neighbors offered sympathetic looks at the mailbox. But something had shifted inside her during those long nights alone in a house that suddenly felt too big and too fragile. She started noticing things she'd ignored for years: the thin walls that barely held heat, the furnace that struggled every January, the way a single power outage could leave her sitting in the dark, helpless and waiting for someone else to fix it. She didn't want to feel that way anymore. So she started preparing. At first, it seemed reasonable enough. She bought extra canned goods, filled water jugs, picked up a battery radio at the hardware store. Normal things. But then she kept going, kept thinking, kept imagining scenarios where normal preparations wouldn't be enough. By June, contractors were pulling permits for major cellar renovations. That's when the neighborhood started paying attention. "What exactly are you doing down there?" her neighbor Diane asked one afternoon, watching workers haul steel panels through Janet's front door. "Reinforcing the foundation," Janet said evenly. The inspector said it needed work. It wasn't a lie, technically. The foundation did need work. But what Janet didn't mention was that she'd designed the repairs herself, transforming the old cellar into something far more deliberate. A sealed shelter capable of maintaining temperature and airflow independent of the house above it. She hired a welder to help her line the walls with insulated steel panels, creating a thermal barrier that would trap heat and block cold. She installed a separate ventilation system with concealed exterior vents. She ran dedicated propane lines to a small heater rated for enclosed spaces. She added shelving, storage, a chemical toilet, a water filtration system, battery banks, and LED strips that ran on almost nothing. The work took 3 months and cost nearly every dollar from the divorce settlement. And Millbrook noticed all of it. "She's building a bunker," someone said at the grocery store, loud enough for others to hear. Like she's expecting World War III or something. At the coffee shop on Main Street, the jokes started circulating. Janet Pierce, the prepper lady, the survivalist, the woman who thought the apocalypse was coming to a town where the most exciting thing that happened all year was the county fair. Diane stopped waving. The couple across the street started whispering whenever Janet checked her mail. Teenagers slowed their cars near her house, filming the exterior on their phones, posting videos with captions like "Doomsday Prepper in Iowa" that got shared across 3 counties. Janet saw all of it, heard the jokes, felt the distance growing between her and everyone else on Maple Street. But she didn't stop, didn't explain, didn't defend herself. Because deep down, she knew something most people refused to accept: that comfort was temporary, that systems failed, that the difference between surviving and suffering often came down to decisions made long before the crisis arrived. By September, the cellar was finished. From the outside, her house looked exactly the same. But beneath it, hidden behind a reinforced door at the bottom of the basement stairs, sat a steel-lined shelter stocked with 3 months of food, clean water, heat, light, and air filtration. She tested every system twice, checked the seals, timed the propane burn rate, calculated her supplies down to the day, and when everything worked exactly as planned, she sealed the door, walked back upstairs, and waited. Because Janet Pierce had learned something important during those lonely months after Greg left. something the rest of Millbrook hadn't figured out yet. The people who survived disasters weren't the ones who hoped for the best. They were the ones who prepared for the worst and kept quiet about it until the moment it mattered. And as October turned cold and the first frost settled across Iowa, Janet restocked her cellar one final time, checked the weather forecast with unusual attention, and noticed something forming in the northern jet stream that made her stomach tighten. A system meteorologists were calling unseasonably volatile, the kind that didn't follow predictable patterns, the kind that could surprise everyone. The ice storm didn't announce itself the way winter usually did in Iowa. It arrived quietly, almost apologetically, as freezing rain that started just after midnight on November 8th and never stopped. By dawn, Millbrook was coated in a thin glaze that made streets shimmer under gray light. By noon, tree branches sagged under the weight. By evening, power lines were snapping. Janet woke to the sound of transformers exploding, sharp cracks echoing across the neighborhood like gunfire. She moved to the window and watched blue flashes light up the pre-dawn darkness as the grid failed section by section, her street going black except for the emergency lights on her propane heater downstairs. She'd been monitoring the forecast for 3 days, watching the system stall over the Midwest instead of moving through like it should have. Freezing rain accumulating at rates that made even the weather service sound nervous. Ice thickness approaching levels that could collapse infrastructure. She'd already moved supplies into the cellar, already tested the heat, already filled every water container and checked the door seals one last time. While her neighbors slept, trusting their furnaces and electric blankets, Janet had quietly prepared for exactly this scenario. By 8 a.m., the temperature inside her house had dropped to 52 degrees. Outside, ice coated everything: trees, cars, roofs, roads, transforming Millbrook into something brittle and dangerous. The power didn't flicker back on. The utility company's automated message said crews couldn't operate safely in current conditions, estimated restoration in 24 to 48 hours. But Janet had lived through enough Iowa winters to know this storm wasn't going to clear in 2 days. The freezing rain kept falling, the ice kept accumulating, and the temperature kept dropping. She descended the basement stairs, sealed the reinforced door behind her, and felt the immediate difference. Where the house above had grown cold and drafty, the cellar held steady at 68 degrees. The propane heater glowed softly against the steel-lined walls. LED strips cast clean light across shelves stocked with food, water, blankets, books. The ventilation system hummed quietly, pulling fresh air through concealed vents while exhausting moisture and CO2. It worked exactly as she designed it to. A sealed environment that didn't fight the cold. It ignored it completely. For 2 days, Janet stayed underground while the storm worsened. She rationed propane carefully, cooked simple meals on a camping stove, read by LED light, listened to battery-powered radio reports that grew increasingly grim. Ice accumulation exceeding 6 inches in some areas. Entire towns without power. Shelters opening for displaced families. Roads impassable. Emergency services overwhelmed. Above her, she could hear the house settling, creaking under the weight of ice accumulating on the roof. Once, a sharp crack echoed through the walls, a tree branch snapping, maybe, or part of the garage roof buckling. But down in the shelter, nothing changed. The temperature held. The air stayed clean. The lights remained steady. On the 3rd morning, Janet heard the first knock. Not on the cellar door, on the front door upstairs. Faint but persistent. She climbed the basement stairs and peered through the frosted window to see Diane standing on the porch, wrapped in blankets, shivering violently. Janet opened the door. Cold air rushed in like a physical force. "My heat's been out for 2 days," Diane said, her voice shaking. "I can see my breath inside my house. I didn't know where else to go." For a long moment, Janet just looked at her. This woman who'd stopped waving months ago, who'd whispered about the crazy prepper lady to anyone who'd listen. And she remembered every dismissive look, every joke, every time Diane had made her feel like an outsider for doing exactly what was now keeping her alive. Then she stepped aside. "Come in." Diane nearly collapsed from relief. Janet led her downstairs, through the basement, to the reinforced door that opened. Into warmth and light. Diane stopped in the doorway, staring at the steel-lined shelter like she'd discovered another world. "How is this even possible?" she whispered. "Insulation," Janet said simply. "And planning." She gave Diane hot tea, a blanket, a place to sit near the heater. And Diane cried, not from cold anymore, but from something deeper. Shame, maybe, or the sudden understanding of how badly she'd misjudged the woman who'd spent months preparing for exactly this moment. By that evening, 2 more neighbors had arrived, the Hendersons from across the street, their elderly furnace dead, their pipes frozen. Then the Carlsons with their 2 young kids, scared and half-frozen after 3 nights in a house that had become uninhabitable. Janet let them all in. She didn't lecture, didn't say "I told you so." Just organized sleeping areas, rationed supplies, maintained the systems that kept them all safe, while the storm continued burying Millbrook under inches of ice that wouldn't melt for days. And sometime after midnight, when everyone else had finally fallen asleep and the shelter held steady at 68 degrees, Janet sat alone near the heater and allowed herself one quiet moment of vindication. Because she'd been right, and the shelter she'd built, while everyone laughed, was now the only warm place for miles. The ice storm lasted 6 days. By the time it ended, Millbrook looked like a war zone: collapsed roofs, down power lines, trees split in half, roads buried under frozen debris. The National Guard arrived on day 7 to find whole sections of the county still without heat, elderly residents hypothermic in their homes, shelters overflowing with displaced families. But inside Janet Pierce's cellar, 11 people had survived in steady warmth with enough food, water, and heat to last another month if needed. When the power finally returned and the roads cleared enough for people to go home, they left quietly, one by one, with words that came hard but came nonetheless. "Thank you. I'm sorry. I was wrong." Diane was the last to leave. She stood at Janet's front door, bundled in the coat she'd arrived in 6 days earlier, and looked back at the woman who'd saved her life. "I don't know how to apologize for the way we treated you," she said finally. Janet leaned against the doorframe, exhausted but calm. "You don't have to. We called you paranoid. We laughed at you." "I know," Janet said. "But storms don't care who was right before they arrived. They just come." Diane nodded slowly, something shifting in her expression. "Will you teach me how to prepare like you did?" Janet paused, surprised. Then she glanced back toward the cellar, toward the steel-lined shelter that had kept them all alive, and felt something loosen in her chest. The isolation she'd carried for months finally easing. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I can do that." Over the following weeks, Millbrook began to change. Not dramatically, but in small, deliberate ways. Diane installed a backup heating system. The Hendersons stockpiled emergency supplies. The Carlsons asked Janet to help them reinforce their basement. Word spread, not as gossip this time, but as genuine interest. People stopped laughing and started asking questions, real ones, about insulation, ventilation, propane systems, food storage. The local hardware store sold out of emergency supplies within a month. The county even invited Janet to speak at a town hall about winter preparedness, and she stood in front of the same people who'd mocked her and laid out, step by step, how to build resilience into homes that weren't designed for disasters. By spring, 3 other families on Maple Street had reinforced their cellars. 2 more installed independent heating systems. And when the next winter rolled around, milder this time, nothing like the ice storm, Millbrook was ready in a way it had never been before. Janet returned to her quiet routines. She worked from home, tended her garden, kept her systems maintained. But now when she checked the mail, Diane waved from across the street. The Carlson kids shouted hello when they biked past. People stopped to chat instead of whispering. And late one evening in December, as the first snow of the season began to fall softly outside, Janet descended the basement stairs one more time, opened the reinforced door, and stood in the steel-lined shelter that had proven itself when it mattered most. The shelves were restocked, the propane tank full, the systems tested and ready. Not because she expected another disaster immediately, but because she understood something fundamental about survival. That preparation wasn't paranoia. It was responsibility. She ran her hand along the cool steel wall, remembering the months she'd spent welding these panels into place while everyone laughed. Remembering the isolation, the doubt, the nights she'd wondered if she was making a mistake. And then she remembered the storm, the knock on her door, the moment when everything she'd built became the difference between suffering and safety for 11 people who'd once thought she was crazy. Janet turned off the lights and sealed the door behind her. climbing back upstairs to a house that no longer felt too big or too fragile. Because she'd learned something Greg's leaving had forced her to understand, that strength didn't come from depending on systems that could fail or people who could leave. It came from building something solid enough to stand when everything else collapsed. And as snow continued falling softly over Millbrook, covering the streets in quiet white, Janet Pierce sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and a weather report that showed nothing unusual on the horizon, and allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in years. Not vindication, not pride, just the simple, steady comfort of knowing she was ready for winter, for storms, for whatever came next, and that this time, she wouldn't be facing it alone.